three children are in good health. Kevin is all right, but he did suffer a wound. Randy's in good health. Unfortunately, Vicky is dead.
Never will you take another woman down. Never. We're going to war.
Those eyes were like a poison deep in my mind. You're like a siren I couldn't fight.
Hey, what's going on, Stefan?
Nothing much, man. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm just getting over being sick for multiple days. I'm not as bad as I was 2 days ago because
Yeah.
I was dying, but
Well,
today I'm still.
Hey, man. We're here, ready to tell everybody about this story, and I hope you guys enjoy this one. It's something a little bit different.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, today we're going all the way back to 1992, just 2 years after I was born. This is a very big deal, actually. In 92, it was a big government thing. You know, most people have heard of the Waco siege, the siege of Waco. Well, this happened about 8 months before that. Today we're talking about Randy Weaver and the siege of Ruby Ridge. And combined with the siege of Waco, these two things were big motivators for Timothy McVeigh, who was a perpetrator of the Oklahoma City bombings in 1995. The siege of Waco and the siege of Ruby Ridge, he claims, is why he did the Oklahoma City bombings. So, yeah, today we're talking about Randy Weaver and the siege of Ruby Ridge.
The Siege of Ruby Ridge was a 10-day siege in northern Idaho near the city of Naples. It began on August 21st, 1992, and ended on August 31st. It began when Randy Weaver, his immediate family members, and a family friend, Kevin Harris, resisted agents of the United States Marshal Service and the hostage rescue team of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. After Randy Weaver's failure to appear on firearms charges, a bench warrant was issued, and the U.S. Marshals were sent to the Weaver property in pursuit of the warrant. An initial encounter between the Weavers and 6 U.S. Marshals resulted in a shootout, and the deaths of the Weaver's son, Samuel, who was 14 at the time, Deputy U.S. Marshal William Francis Deegan, and the Weaver's family dog. In the subsequent siege of the Weaver's residence, led by the FBI, Weaver's 43-year-old wife Vicky was killed by an FBI sniper. All casualties occurred on the first 2 days of this operation. The siege and standoff were ultimately resolved by civil negotiators, with the surrender and arrest of Kevin Harris on August 30th, and the surrender of Randy Weaver and the surviving Weaver children the next day. At the time of the standoff, the Weaver family consisted of the father and husband, Randy Weaver, the wife and mother, Vicky Weaver, the son Samuel Weaver, the middle daughter Sarah Weaver, and younger daughter Rachel Weaver. There was also a newborn in the house by the name of Elishaba Weaver. Kevin Harris, a friend of the family, was also on the property during the siege. Kevin was 23 years old, and he had lived with the Weavers since he was a teenager, and considered Randy to be a father figure to him.
Yeah, and so after going through all of that, like you just did, you know, you might suspect that the Weaver family and Randy in general, that you might suspect that there's some crazy gun-toting rednecks. And as we'll go over later, you know, the FBI definitely, and the ATF definitely, you know, saw them this way. They painted a picture of Randy Weaver as being this lunatic up on a hill with his family, you know, basically resisting, like he's this huge criminal, like he's just this terrible person, and he's just up there killing officers. That is how Randy and Kevin Harris, and honestly Vicky Weaver, the mom, that's how they're painted and portrayed, you know, during this siege.
And it's also like the media also painted the location of this place to be very different from what it actually was. Like they
Like a fortress.
Yeah, they essentially said it was like a giant compound, or alluded to that. Like,
Yeah, and really, it was just a cabin that they actually built themselves out of plywood, and that sounds kind of rinky dink, but it was actually really nice if you look at pictures
Yeah,
of
it
it.
was.
It looked really nice, especially considering that they just built it themselves for, very cheap. So again, we'll go over the picture that Randy and his family, what they were painted as. But I just wanted to get that out. They're not some crazy, insane nut jobs that the law
however, they do
enforcement.
have radical ideas.
Yeah,
I mean,
they
you
definitely
can't
have
leave
some-
that out.
Yeah, we'll go over that. They definitely have some radical ideas. So Randy Weaver was a former Iowa factory worker and U.S. Army combat engineer. He moved with his family to northern Idaho during the early 1980s so they could, homeschool the children and escape what he and his wife Vicky saw as a corrupted world. Vicky, who was the main religious influence of the family, began to have recurring dreams of living on a mountaintop. In 1978, she believed that an apocalypse was imminent.
This is actually interesting. There's a verse in Matthew where she got this idea from.
Yeah, it was a biblical apocalypse.
Yeah, I think it was like Matthew 22. I'm not exactly sure, but it was.
Yeah, definitely. And after the birth of their first son, Samuel, the Weavers started to put their plan into action. They began selling their belongings and learning how to live without electricity, running water, and perfected their abilities to provide their own food. In 1983, they bought 20 acres of land on Ruby Ridge and began building a cabin out of mostly plywood that they got from lumber yards. The Weaver property was located in northern Idaho in Boundary County, on a hillside on Ruby Creek opposite Caribou Ridge near Naples. Only a year after moving to this hillside property, Randy Weaver had a dispute over a $3,000 land deal with his neighbor, Terry Kinnison. Kinnison ended up losing the ensuing suit and was ordered to pay Weaver an additional $2,100 in court costs and damages. Kinnison wrote letters to the FBI, Secret Service, and county sheriff alleging Weaver had threatened to kill the Pope, the president, and John V. Evans, who was the governor of Idaho.
About a year later, the FBI and the Secret Service began an investigation on the allegations that Randy Weaver had made threats to the president and other law enforcement. On February 12th, Randy and Vicky Weaver were interviewed by 2 FBI agents, 2 secret agents, and the Boundary County Sheriff and his chief investigator. The Secret Service were told that Weaver was a member of the Aryan Nations and that he had a large weapon cache at his residence. Weaver denied the allegations, and no charges were filed at this time. Again, this was 1983 and 84, after the Weaver family had moved up to northern Idaho to live a separatist, remote lifestyle, living off of the land and raising their family in the Christian way that they saw fit. One of the main Aryan Nations compounds was only 16 miles away from their cabin. Randy started going mainly as a social thing. They went to family picnics and other sort of family-based events. Eventually, though, as being around them more, he began to believe more into their message. It's not believed that they knew the Aryan Nation compound was that close when they originally moved there, and there was no evidence to suggest that Randy was a racist or that he had ever been involved in any type of Aryan Nation practices before. They found that they believed in they had a lot of common ground with this group of people, and I wouldn't say that Randy's views were necessarily... Well, I'll say this, Randy was considered a moderate by these people. Their views were a lot more extreme than his, but they did share a lot of common ground, mostly sort of aligning each other with their Christian aspects and lifestyle. Randy didn't want to join the Aryan Nations, however. He didn't see that causing violence to other races or going out there to hurt people intentionally and then breaking the law was the life he wanted to live. And he goes on to say during a lot of interviews, he sort of talks about his distrust for Jewish people specifically. And again, this is where he aligns with the Aryan nations, but I would say he wanted to be away from them more than anything, meaning Jewish people. He wanted to just be left alone by the government and by minorities and live his own Christian life with his family.
Yeah, and the thing about it is he didn't have to go to the Aryan Nation compound. Just what I'm saying is, anyone could say that he wasn't really a racist. I think that in interviews he kind of claims to not really be a racist, but it's like, you're going to this compound to meet people and to go to family events with obvious racist, where, whites only, pictures or whatever, plaques, whites only plaques are at the front of the compound where they hold huge, racist events at this place. So, like, he's definitely a racist.
In this particular group of the Aryan nations, they were called the Order, and they were known for doing all sorts of stuff like counterfeiting money, and there was also like a murder that they thought they were related to in this area of Naples.
Yeah, and so I don't think it's, his idea, Randy Weaver's idea of being sort of a separatist out in the middle of nowhere, living with his family. I don't think that's too insane. I think that it started to get kind of crazy when he started to attend these meetings.
Definitely.
So, like earlier we said that, his views aren't all crazy, but some of them are. And it's like, to me, I find a link with Randy as it'd be nice to go build a cabin in the middle of the woods and live out there alone. I mean, that sounds really relaxing.
Yeah, definitely.
But I probably wouldn't go to Aryan Nation meetings.
Yeah, definitely not. Skip out on those.
So in July 1986, Randy Weaver was invited by Frank Kumanik to the World Aryan Congress, which was a large gathering of the Aryan Nation. Weaver was introduced to someone who had been turned into an ATF informant. The ATF informant portrayed himself as a weapons dealer, and over the next 3 years, Weaver and the informant would meet several times. In July 1989, exactly 3 years later, Weaver invited the informant to his house on Ruby Ridge to discuss forming a group to fight the Zionist organized government, which he obviously was referring to the U.S. government. In October of the same year, the informant asked Randy Weaver if Randy would be able to saw off a couple shotguns for him, and Randy agreed. Randy sold the informant 2 sawed-off shotguns, with the overall length of the shotguns shorter than the legal limit set by federal law. Eventually, the ATF informant was outed to the Aryan Nation's security, and the ATF ordered him to have no further contact with Weaver. So in June 1990, an ATF agent attempted to get Weaver to act as an ATF informant himself, and he used the sawed-off shotgun charges as leverage. He wanted Weaver to basically do and be what the last informant was, and go into the Aryan nations and infiltrate them. Randy refused to become a snitch and told them basically to fuck off, and the ATF filed gun charges that exact same month. The ATF also claimed that Randy was a bank robber, but this was eventually proven to be false, as Randy had no criminal record and there was no proof whatsoever that Randy had committed a bank robbery. A federal grand jury would indict Randy Weaver in December of that same year for making and possessing the illegal weapons, but not for selling them. After the ATF had concluded that it would be too dangerous for arresting agents to arrest Randy on his property, 2 ATF agents posed as broken-down motorists and waited for Randy and Vicky to stop and help them. They did stop and help. And when Randy was looking over the engine of the car, the arresting agents pulled weapons on them and arrested Randy on the spot. Randy was told the weapons charges that he was being arrested for, and he was taken into custody and then he was released on bail. He was told that his trial would begin on February 19th. The trial date was changed to the 20th, one day after it was originally planned. Multiple letters were sent to the Weaver residence trying to tell him that the date had changed, but Weaver never responded or tried to get in contact with his court-appointed lawyer. Weaver also did not have a telephone in the cabin.
So long story short, Randy did not appear in court on February 20th. It should be stated that the Weaver's court appointment lawyer sent Randy a letter with the incorrect date on it, which was March 20th instead of February 20th. However, no attempt by Randy was made on March 20th either, and it calls into question as to whether Randy would have even shown up to court, Randy didn't trust the government, and for good reason. He didn't trust his lawyer, and I think that the letter with the wrong date on it made him distrust his lawyer even more. He was a paranoid person, and you really start to see that now. He was told by his magistrate that if he lost the trial, he would also lose his land, which would leave Vicky homeless, and that the government would take his children away. He didn't believe he would win the case, and he didn't want to lose his entire life, his home, his children, his wife, over what he believed to be an entrapment by the government on weapons charges. At this point, Randy became a fugitive on the run. Unlike most fugitives who cross state lines and run, Randy stayed in his remote cabin and seemingly threatened to resist any attempt to take him by force. U.S. Marshal officers made a series of attempts to have Weaver surrender peacefully, but Weaver refused to leave the cabin. The U.S. attorney directed that all negotiations should go through the Weaver's court-appointed lawyer, but Weaver did not have any contact with him and refused to speak to him. Again, the Weavers had no telephones at all, so they could only be contacted by mail or going up to the cabin itself. U.S. Marshals let Randy sit up in his cabin for about a year before making any moves. In March of 1992, 5 months before the siege would begin, surveillance teams were dispatched and cameras were set up to record the activity at the Weavers' residence. They recorded 5 months of activity to try and get an idea of exactly what they were dealing with up there. The U.S. Marshals made Randy out to be an insane, racist, gun-toting hillbilly in his cabin on top of a mountain. They made sure everyone believed that, and they wanted everyone to know exactly who they were dealing with. They also believed that any type of attempt to arrest Randy would result in a gunfight and the possible deaths of many people. What would become would be just that, but not because Randy was some sort of lunatic. The mistakes that were made by the ATF and the U.S. Marshals, and the mistakes that they made would end up being fatal.
Yeah, so let's recap real quick. So Randy Weaver and his family moved up to a remote hillside in northern Idaho and built a cabin, just so they could live a separatist lifestyle. Randy began going to Aryan Nation meetings and met someone who ended up being an ATF informant. The ATF informant asked Randy to provide him with illegal sawed-off shotguns, which Randy did. The ATF then tried to leverage the weapons charge against Randy, trying to make him become an ATF informant himself, but he refused. They brought weapon charges against him, and Randy never showed up for court. Randy became a fugitive, and he and his family stayed up in their cabin for almost a year with not much activity. Word about this got around to people in town, and a local newspaper wrote an article basically about a folk hero-like man up on a mountaintop refusing to come down. This article was picked up by bigger newspapers, made its way around the nation. The publicity Randy was getting prompted the ATF and the U.S. Marshals to take action.
In early 1991, the U.S. Marshals began to put together a threat source profile on Randy. The profile was later criticized for many reasons. As Marshals investigated the Weaver case, they learned facts that contradicted information that they had previously been provided, but never made changes or updates to their overall assessment. The Marshals also used many people as third-party go-betweens on the Weaver case, but they had eventually been evaluated as being more radical than Weaver himself. So the people that they were getting to give information were as crazy or
More
crazier
crazy.
than Randy himself. So Marshal Dave Hunt asked Bill Greeter the question, "Why shouldn't I just go up there and talk to him?" Bill Greeter replied, "Let me put it to you this way. If I was sitting on my property when someone with a gun comes to do harm to me, I'd probably shoot him." This was not the words of Randy Weaver, and it was not a threat by Randy Weaver, but it was incorrectly reported as a threat by Randy. They put that into their assessment.
Yeah, so they put into their assessment, basically what you just said is a neighbor said that if people came onto his property with weapons trying to arrest him, that he would shoot them. This was a neighbor of Randy
And
Weaver.
they quoted as being Randy.
Yeah,
who
they
said it.
quoted. Yeah, exactly. They quoted it as Randy. Also, it should be said that even the latest documentaries on the subject that featured Dave Hunt, the marshal that was there, the marshal that asked the neighbor that question, even the newest documentaries that featured Dave Hunt still have Dave Hunt on camera saying that Randy made this statement. So, I watched the most recent PBS documentary that was in 2017 on Ruby Ridge, and Dave Hunt is on camera saying that Randy made these statements. He is on camera in 2017 basically saying that Randy made the statement that if anyone came to his property that he would shoot. So even in 2017, the Maine U.S. Marshal is still saying, we were okay for being this cautious because we knew that Randy was going to come down. But none of the documentaries ever say that he never said that. It's like most of the documentaries are basically against the U.S. government. They're basically for Randy because obviously the U.S. government really messed up overall in this situation. But they never say that. They always sort of give him the benefit of the doubt and say that, Randy was this crazy gun-toting lunatic that said that if anyone comes to my property with guns, I'm going to kill him. But he never said that.
Right.
And the threat profile that was made on Randy included a brief psychological profile completed by a person who had conducted no first-hand interviews. And he was so unfamiliar with the case that he referred to Weaver as Mr. Randall. So his entire psych evaluations was blown completely out of proportion, based on the people they interviewed, the people who were conducting the evaluation, and a bunch of other aspects of it. And real quick, I kind of want to go back over with you, if you want, about the court dates. Mm-hmm. So it was originally for the 19th of February. They moved it to the 20th, and his lawyer, again, sent him a letter saying March 20th. So this is not brought up by anyone either. If you go online, you talk to people in comments, no one knows about this. And in documentaries, they usually don't bring it up either. They never bring this up.
Right, they were just giving all sorts of not on purpose, obviously. It was his lawyer, but he was getting all sorts of false information.
He thinks that.
Yeah,
Randy will think it.
He's already paranoid enough. He doesn't need any more reason to be paranoid.
And so originally they were going to wait to see if Randy showed up on March 20th, but they didn't end up doing that. Originally they said they would, but a judge ended up filing 4 days before on March 16th, 4 days before March 20th. He ended up filing to make him a fugitive of the law. So it wasn't, on the run. So it wasn't, they didn't even wait till March 20th. Originally they were going to, but they ended up not. And like you said before, maybe he would have shown up, maybe he wouldn't have shown up, but we don't know. We don't know if he ever would have.
Yeah, if you ask me, I don't think he would have, honestly.
Probably not. He probably wouldn't have shown up, but they didn't make very good attempts to let him even know.
Yeah.
So he didn't have a telephone. It's not against the law to not have a telephone.
Right. And he was also stated as telling the agents to go to hell when they tried to get him to become a snitch in the first place. They knew he wasn't going to come easily.
Yeah, I mean, they could have, and they have all this false information about going up there and getting him.
On August 21st, 1992, after many months of video surveillance, 6 marshals were sent out to scout the area and to determine suitable places away from the cabin to ambush and arrest Randy Weaver. The marshals had M16s, night vision goggles, and had been dressed up in tactical gear and military camouflage. So the family dogs had caught the scent of the agents nearby, and it had them barking and going crazy and on edge. Kevin Harris, who's the family friend, and the 14-year-old son, Samuel, came out of the cabin and followed the dog Striker to investigate. They were hoping and believing that the dog had caught a scent of some wild game in the area because they were desperate for some food in the cabin. Again, these people were holed up in here for 18 months. It was later claimed that the dogs were alerted to the marshals in the woods after a neighbor from down the mountain at the foot started their pickup truck. Once the dog got the scent of the marshals actually retreated to the Y junction in the trails, which was about 500 yards west of the cabin, out of sight from the cabin itself. Samuel and Kevin followed the dog through the woods on foot, and Randy was coming as well, but had taken a different logging trail, Vicky and the remaining children stayed behind in the cabin. Randy encountered the marshals first at the Y Junction trail, and the marshals yelled, "Back off, U.S. Marshals, stop, U.S. Marshals, freeze, Randy." About a minute later, the dog and Samuel and Kevin came out of the woods. How the shooting began and who exactly shot 14-year-old Samuel in the back has always been subject to controversy. The general consensus is that the marshals fired upon the Weaver's dog first, which hit the dog in the spine, and basically the dog started whimpering and crying and dropped dead. When that happened, Samuel is reported to have begun firing at the U.S. Marshals, at which case the marshals would return fire. Samuel was shot in the back and was killed while he was running away to retreat. So the U.S. Marshal Deegan was also shot and killed by Kevin Harris.
Yeah, so again, Randy made it to the trail first, and, he basically was like, okay, calm down. About a minute later, Samuel and Kevin and the dog came around the corner. And from what I've read, the dog, from Kevin's point of view, the dog kind of ran up to the marshal and was kind of dancing around him, and the marshal shot him. And, of course, the marshals say, the dog came up and was trying to attack them.
Right.
And who knows what actually happened. But like you said, the marshal shot first. So a firefight did ensue, and the marshals originally killed the dog. And, the thing is Samuel was 14 years old.
And he raised the dog himself, too, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. So he raised this dog, and this guy just killed him. Now, the U.S. Marshals are on their property. And so it's one of those things like, if you come onto my property and shoot my dog, what do you expect?
And you're an emotional 14-year-old that's been held in a cabin for 18 months.
Yeah, and you could make the argument that this 14-year-old kid shouldn't have been running out there with a rifle anyways.
Sure.
So it's kind of weird, but it's at the same time these people are on their property and they're shooting. That's all they know. And this guy just shot his dog. How does he know that they're not going to shoot them next?
Right.
They're in this camouflage tactical gear.
Well, it would make sense for Samuel to have a gun if they thought they had smelt game in the area as well.
That's true.
To me, if you live in the mountains and you're in that lifestyle, it's not all that weird to have a gun.
Yeah, definitely. You're right. And so he's out there. And then, again, the U.S. Marshals start shooting. So it's not that... it's not that out of the question to think that this 14-year-old kid is going to fire back, because they don't know. And again,
Right.
like you said, he was shot in the back while he was retreating. A 14-year-old kid was.
Yeah, the last word Samuel would ever say was, you shot Stryker, you son of a bitch, and then he started firing towards the marshals.
After the firefight at the Y Junction, the remaining marshals went to a neighbor's house to call for assistance. Randy and Vicky eventually went to the Y Junction and retrieved Samuel's body and placed it in the shed near the cabin. In the aftermath of the firefight, Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus declared a state of emergency in Boundary County. The Marshals Service Special Operations Group was deployed, and the use of the Idaho National Guard Armory was allowed. And the Idaho State Police then arrived at the scene. The FBI responded by sending the hostage rescue team to the location. A 10-day standoff would follow. Special rules of engagement were drafted and approved by the FBI and the Marshal Service for the use on Ruby Ridge. They got rid of the typical FBI rules of engagement and put into play a very militarized rules of engagement. They basically allowed deadly force to be used if any adult in the area around the cabin is observed with a weapon after the surrender announcement. So basically, after the surrender announcement was made, any adult in the area with a weapon could be shot and killed without being warned. However, also in the rules of engagement, it said that any male adults in the area with a weapon before the surrender announcement is made could be shot and killed without being warned. So basically, they were sending negotiators up there, and they had to talk and try to get them to surrender. After that talk had occurred, and they were either going to surrender or not surrender, if they hadn't surrendered, it then became any adult, male or female, with a weapon on the property could be shot on sight. So they didn't have to shoot at all. If they just saw any adult walking around the property with a weapon, they could shoot them. And before the negotiators got there, that the same rules of engagement was applied, but for males only. So before they had talked to anyone, they had never even talked to negotiators. They didn't know who was on their property. They didn't know the FBI was there or not there. They didn't know anything. All they knew is that someone was in the woods because they had just, gone to a firefight with somebody, but they didn't know who was watching them. And at that point, before they had talked to anyone, if any male adult on the property had a weapon, you could shoot and kill without being warned at all.
Yeah, license to kill.
Yeah, and it's the craziest thing ever. I mean, not every... So they brought in snipers, but not all of the snipers completely agreed with what was happening, and not everyone agreed with the rules of engagement anyways. I mean, this was this insane rules of engagement that they had put in place.
Yeah, and when you think about the snipers or the military people involved also, I do almost sympathize to the fact that, listen, these people got to where they are in the military by following orders. That's what you do. You're not allowed to necessarily think and debate the moral aspects of what you're doing, and you're just supposed to do as you're told, But it sort of comes from the top down in this point. If the rules of engagement were terrible to begin with, I just don't see a way where this could have worked out for anyone.
No, yeah, definitely.
So on the second day of the siege, Randy Weaver decided to go and visit his dead son, Samuel, in the shed where his body was. FBI sniper Lon Horucci was positioned about 200 yards north and above the Weaver's cabin. Just before Randy got inside of the shed to see his son, the sniper shot and wounded Randy in the back with the bullet exiting his right armpit. So he was essentially shot in the shoulder, and the bullet exited through his right armpit. Randy's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah, and Kevin ran to see what was wrong. When they had realized Randy was shot, they started to run back towards the house. As Kevin was entering the house, the sniper fired a second bullet through the door of the cabin, which Vicky Weaver had been standing behind. The bullet went through Vicky's head, killing her instantly, and wounded Kevin in the chest after the bullet went through Vicky. Vicky was holding her 10-month-old baby, Elishaba, in her arms when she was shot. Just to make it clear, FBI sniper Lon Horucci fired a shot from 200 yards away through the front of the cabin door, killing Vicky instantly before the surrender announcement was made. Not only did he break the ridiculous rules of engagement that had been set up, he fired through a door not knowing who was on the other side. It could have been a child, which there was, as again the 10-month-old was in Vicky's arms as she was killed. Everyone was running back to the cabin. No one was any imminent threat to anyone. They were hunting the family at this point.
Yeah, they really were. They were hunting the family at this point. It's mind-blowing. It's he said just to make it clear, and it's because they shot through he shot through the cabin door. It's like this sniper just had his own whole rules of engagement. He was like, you know what? They made it kind of crazy. I'm just shooting.
Right.
And Randy, when he went to visit his son in the shed, he had a weapon in his hand. So technically, following these rules of engagement, the sniper was fine to shoot him in the back from 200 yards away without warning him. Technically, that's right. But then as they're running through the door, he tries to shoot Kevin Harris, right? Because Kevin Harris runs through the door, so he shoots through the door. And that bullet's powerful enough to go through the door, through Vicky's head, into Kevin, because he wounded Kevin after he killed Vicky.
Yeah, it said that pieces of her actual jawbone flew into Kevin and punctured his lungs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And Sarah got splayed, right? Mm-hmm. Sprayed with body mass from
her
Vicky.
Mother.
Yeah. And the baby fell to the floor. It's one of those things where if the sniper had shot a few feet, maybe 2 feet even lower, he would have just killed the 10-month-old baby. What would have happened then?
Right.
It's like they've already killed the 14-year-old, They've already killed the 14-year-old. It's like, let's just start killing people.
It
now.
almost seems at this point they're like, fine, Randy, if we can't get you, then we're going to make you submit, essentially. Kill everyone around you.
Exactly. So over the following few days, the hostage negotiators would start. They started in the morning after all of this happened. So all that happened on the second day. So this is on the third day, and they began to start negotiations. And they started to speak with Vicky, and they didn't know. So they didn't know that Vicky had been shot and killed. Again, this is because they shot through the door. They don't know, the sniper doesn't know what he hit. So he doesn't even know who he hit. They don't know that they killed Vicky. So they would ask Vicky to send out the kids, saying that they were making pancakes. They would ask Vicky to help them out because they believed she was strong and could convince Randy to do the right thing. Again, not realizing that they had already shot and killed her. Randy and the rest of the family in the cabin took this as great insult and were deeply offended. They believed that they were being taunted by the FBI, and for good reason. In Randy's mind, everything he believed and had been taught about the government was coming true. Eventually, Randy yelled out back at the FBI, which happened to be his first response to them, saying, "You killed my wife, you cowardly sons of bitches." The Weavers didn't have a phone in their cabin, again, so the FBI put a phone outside the porch of the cabin using a robotic machine. Paul Harvey, who was a radio broadcaster, tried to appeal to Randy on his program, basically telling him to come out and pick up the phone, that they would find a defense lawyer to represent him in court over the death of U.S. Marshal Deegan, and they needed to know what to do with the body of Samuel, which the FBI had gotten out of the shed near the cabin. However, the family didn't know who to trust, and they didn't trust anyone. They didn't know if they would reach out of the door onto the porch to get the phone and be shot and killed. They didn't trust anyone at all at this point. To their knowledge, the 14-year-old son had been killed. Their dog had been killed, the 14-year-old son had been killed, and now their mother was shot through the door in the head.
Yeah, for every reason they moved away to get to Ruby Ridge is what is happening to them, basically. This is what they wanted to escape from.
Exactly. And, something that I feel like a lot of people don't think about is what was going through Vicky's mind. Vicky died there. She died. Think about the life she lived. She believed all of this stuff. She moved to this mountaintop with her family because of all this. And then she's shot in the head by an FBI sniper.
Right. In a way, it was her sort of apocalypse that they had been prophesizing about.
Exactly.
At this point, the FBI and the ATF started to contact family members of both Randy and Vicky. They were told that the Weaver family didn't move from northern Idaho because they were white supremacists or racists. They went because they wanted to get away from everyone, and that they believed that an apocalyptic event was on the horizon. The newspapers started to change their narrative from Randy Weaver being an insane, gun-toting racist to being the head of a close-knit religious family. The FBI started to realize that they came into a situation that they had been vastly overjudged, and it had not been what they had previously thought. The FBI needed someone that they could use to help them negotiate with, and someone that Randy could trust. Bo Greitz was a former Green Beret. He was part of his Christian identity movement that Randy had also taken a liking to. Randy was also a Green Beret. The FBI brought Bo Greitz up to the cabin in a Jeep for the first time, and he stood outside of the cabin and spoke to Randy. This is the first time that Randy had begun any sort of negotiation from his end. He spoke to Bo and told him exactly what had happened. Harris was wounded, he was wounded, and his wife and son were dead. Bo went down and relayed the news, and the reaction was not positive at all. Days before this, a huge amount of people had shown up in support of the Weavers, friends in the community, people from their church, and many other groups of people related to that area. So all of these people got together in support of a large protest against the government. They were not happy with this news at all.
The next day, Bo Greitz went back up to the cabin and convinced Randy Weaver to allow Kevin Harris to leave the cabin and get medical support. Kevin Harris was in a very, very bad situation. He was in very bad condition, and he was in a lot of pain. He was transferred and airlifted to a hospital soon afterwards. After they got Kevin Harris out, they brought up a body bag for Vicky Harris, who had now been laying in the cabin for over a week. On the last day of the standoff, Boegreitz went up to the cabin for the last time and spoke to Randy again. Randy told Bo that the FBI was going to have to kill all of them up there because they weren't going to come out. Eventually, Bo was able to convince Randy that it was not the best choice, and Randy and the girls decided to surrender.
In 1993, Kevin Harris and Randy Weaver were tried for the first-degree murder in the death of U.S. Marshal William Deegan. After the longest jury deliberations in Idaho history, both Randy and Kevin were acquitted. The Weaver family sued the U.S. government for the deaths of Vicky and Samuel Weaver, and Randy was awarded $100,000, and the daughters were awarded $1 million each, for a total of $3.1 million. They originally asked for $200 million, but settled for the 3.1. Quite a big jump there.
Yeah, and I think you told me before when discussing this that multiple sources, lawyers and such, have said that if they hadn't settled and they had kept going and tried to get the full amount, they would have probably gotten it, or they would have gotten at least $100 million.
It's totally doable.
Oh yeah, they were saying that definitely they would have gotten much more than 3.1 million. And so, what do we make of this? What do we make of everything that happened? So Randy, obviously, he was kind of crazy. Mm-hmm. He had some different ideas, and he didn't trust the government. But what exactly did he do wrong? He had a couple sawed-off shotguns for an informant.
I mean, the blame doesn't fall on one side in this case, I don't think. Like, it's very obvious to me that both sides were in the wrong at some point during all of the events of Ruby Ridge.
Yeah, I mean, so he had two sawed-off shotguns. He sold them to the ATF informant, and they tried to get him they tried to use the leverage of the two sawed-off shotguns to make him an informant. Well, he said no. So what do? They arrest him like normal, right? So they arrest him. They take him to jail. He puts his house up on the hill. He puts that house up for bail, for the money to get out. He goes back, and they don't make a ton of effort to make sure he knows that the date is the correct date. In fact, they sent him the wrong date in a letter. So for all he knows, the date that he has to show up for court is March 20th. Well, a judge basically said that he's a fugitive to go after him on March 16th. So that's 4 days before, and we don't know if he would have ever shown up.
Right, yeah, we don't know.
We can speculate that he never would have shown up anyways, but how do we know that for sure?
And it's weird to think about how this case could have turned out differently if that would have been the case. None of the siege would have happened essentially if Randy would have shown up for court. Now we can speculate on whether he would have shown up or not in the first place. I don't know, but I do know obviously this situation could have turned out a lot different. There's a lot of turns that could have been taken.
Yeah, and honestly, the FBI, really the ATF, went way too far for this one.
Right.
I mean, it's not like he was up there it's not like he was up there sawing off shotguns for everyone in the town.
Right.
He only sawed off the two for the informant. Now, I'm not saying that Randy didn't do something wrong. He did, but the ATF, they stretched way too far to get this guy. Mm-hmm. I mean, people say it's entrapment.
Right. And we should mention there were 400 agents surrounding the property. I mean, there was tanks, there was snipers.
All of this for an entrapment of two sawed-off shotguns that he sold to an informant. It's like these very basic weapon charges. And justice should be brought to Randy, but not like this.
Right. And to all of that, it just seems like overkill to me. This house was built out of scrap wood from a lumber yard.
Yeah.
And they're bringing in tanks, they're bringing in snipers. It just doesn't, it seems like a huge oversight on the government. Once that marshal was killed, they were out for blood. And
oh yeah, and why was he killed exactly? Because they were on his property.
Exactly.
In tactical gear with M16 assault rifles with with night vision goggles on their property.
I can't say definitively I would have acted any different from Randy in this situation. If my kid and wife were killed, like, I don't know.
And back to the psych evaluation, again, it's like they didn't have a good psych evaluation on this guy. They took it, if all of this had happened, and then they really needed to arrest this guy for the 2 sawed-off shotguns. I get that. And if they had done a proper psych evaluation, they would have realized that they could have went up there and arrested him. They could have went up there and talked to him. He wasn't absolutely crazy. What made Randy crazy was finding people on his property hidden, and also the 5 months of video surveillance they had.
Right.
Is that not
increasing his paranoia more and more? It should be stated also that the length of the shotgun barrels had to be, for it to be illegal, it has to be over 13 inches, the barrel. Now, the measurements in which the barrels were cut, if you measured it out perfectly at 13 inches and you cut right on the mark, the saw blade enough would be enough to bring it below that 13-inch mark, technically making it illegal. That's how close the measurements were for these guns.
Yeah, so they were barely...
Exactly, barely illegal. I mean, still illegal by law, which I get, fine. You got to draw a line in the sand somewhere. But, I mean, when it comes down to 1/8 of an inch for the death and pain of this family,
and they came up with this crazy psych evaluation that forced them to videotape the family for 5 months and sneak on their property and shoot their dog and shoot the 14-year-old son,
and the negative portrayal in the media.
Exactly. And notice that, like, halfway through the siege, the negative portrayal in the media of the Weaver family got reversed.
Yep.
And then also in the FBI it was reversed, and they realized that, oh man, maybe we weren't right about this.
Right. Yeah. To me, this is clear cut. The government definitely did not do their job.
And they never, even after paying out the $3.1 million, which, by the way, I find kind of strange because Randy only got $100,000.
Right.
And each one of the daughters, including the Elishaba, who was only 10 months old at the time, each one of the daughters got $1 million each. So, I mean, I find that kind of strange. Why wouldn't he get more than $100,000? And Kevin Harris got what, about $350,000?
Right. I think
like
it
that.
was because the charges were against Randy himself.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like he would have gotten more if he wouldn't have, obviously done the work on the shotguns.
Yeah. Well, what's crazy is Kevin Harris got $350,000. And he killed a U.S. Marshal.
Yeah,
and that's what they were originally saying, is that they would never pay out someone who had killed a U.S. Marshal, but they did. And even after they paid out everyone, Kevin Harris and the family, they never admitted to the wrongful deaths of Vicky and Samuel. They never actually admitted any wrongdoing.
Yeah, no apology,
which is kind of crazy. Given. It's like they pay him out, and then they're just just because they settled. If they had lost, if it had gone to actual trial and they didn't settle, and they had to pay out $100 million, I promise you they would have admitted to wrongdoing, because there's no way they're paying out that much money without admitting to something.
Right.
And this was settled, which means originally they didn't have to disclose how much money but they did eventually.
Right.
And also, the sniper that killed Vicky, he was originally arrested, and he was going to be taken to trial for involuntary manslaughter, but he was found... I mean, he never actually went to trial, so he was never found guilty or not guilty. It was sovereign immunity, which basically means that because he did his work for the government, he didn't do anything wrong, technically, which is absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah.
This guy, 8 months later, was at the Waco, with the siege of Waco. He was a sniper at the siege of Waco. And this is 8 months later at the siege. This was a big ATF fuck-up, just like the siege of Ruby Ridge, only 8 months later. Everyone was the same. They were all the same people. All the leaders of the ATF, the snipers they were all the same people. It's only 8 months later. Everyone's
glad
the same.
to know that the government saw their mistakes and corrected for it,
Yeah, because what are they doing now in the FBI?
Right. Well, yeah, it seems... I think that's really the worst part of this. It seems like they didn't learn anything. Like, it was still business as usual for them.
Well, that's the point of Waco. It's like they didn't learn anything, because 8 months later, Waco happened.
Right.
And now they use the siege of Ruby Ridge as training on what not to do in the FBI.
Yeah, well, for good reason.
So I think that's enough admittal of wrongdoing in and of itself.
Right. Well, an apology would have been nice.
Exactly. Sarah Weaver said that.
Yeah.
The daughter, she said that, the fact that they use this as training on what not to do is good enough. That's what she said. She's like, you know what? At least they know that they fucked up bad. So again, basically, I think the biggest mess ups is with the psych evaluation. If they had just realized that they could have just went up there and talked to Randy before any of this happened,
Right.
none of this would have even happened.
And even if they had an accurate profile on the person they were trying to negotiate with, would have been...
Exactly. Because people saw off shotguns all the time, and this doesn't happen.
Right.
And this didn't happen because Randy was crazy. He just sawed off a couple shotguns, and the ATF severely made major mistakes.
Yeah, and again, in some circles, Randy was viewed as a radical, but to Randy and Randy's environment and surroundings, he wasn't considered a radical at all.
It's not like he was, a terrorist going out and committing these crazy crimes.
Right.
He committed one crime that, the government had asked him, under an informant to commit.
Yeah, they essentially blackmailed him. They said, listen, you're going to work for us, or we're going to bring you up on these gun charges. No ifs, ands, or buts. That's how it's going. They gave him an ultimatum, and he said, go to hell.
Exactly.
So, guys, this is the end of our episode on the events of Ruby Ridge. There's actually a lot more to this story. So if you thought it was interesting, go check it out yourself. And
yeah, I think we did a pretty good job of covering it. It's something it's really hard to cover in a 45, 50-minute long podcast. I think we covered some of the things that a lot of people don't talk about, which is the letter.
Right.
A lot of people don't talk about the fact that he received a letter telling him to be at court 2 months after his actual court date.
Right.
And so, yeah, but definitely check it out. And next week, we are doing an episode on the disappearance of Gary Mathias. It's Gary Mathias. I imagine that most people have never heard of this case. It's a very small, unknown case, but it's just absolutely insane. I wish I could just talk about it right now, because it is honestly, it's mind-blowing. It's really thought-provoking. So we're going to talk about that next week. It should be about the same length as this episode, maybe a little shorter, something like that, but it's going to be fun. And always check us out. We're on whatever you're listening to us on, for one thing. But you can go to our website, which is strangelandpod.com. Again, that's strangelandpod.com. We're on Facebook if you look up the Strangeland Podcast. We're on iTunes. We're on SoundCloud.com/strangelandpodcast. We're on Google Play, Stitcher Radio, hopefully Spotify soon. And we're also on basically any podcast app that you can think of. If we're not, send us a message on one of our social media profiles, and check us out on YouTube as well.
Yeah, and if you guys have any suggestions for upcoming episodes, you have stories that you personally find interesting, let us know, and we'll gladly sort of look over them and consider whatever we get.
Most definitely.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, have a good night.
In your